So this is from the Tennessean. This is all about the SBC. So SBC public policy president, a covenant parent, backs Lee's gun law proposal. The head of the Southern Baptist Convention's public policy arm, who is a covenant school parent, is urging the Tennessee General Assembly to back Governor Bill Lee's proposal for an extreme risk protective order law. The Covenant School tragedy was the worst school shooting in our state's history, Brent Leatherwood, president of the Nashville-based Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, wrote in a letter to Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally, House Speaker Cameron Sexton of Crossville, and every member of the legislature. I am asking that you take steps now to ensure no school in Tennessee ever has to endure our nightmare again. Leatherwood's letter, an appeal from both his personal experience and on behalf of majority Southern Baptist sentiment, comes amid uncertainty about the success of Lee's proposal to prevent people deemed a danger to themselves or others from accessing firearms. Lawmakers are rushing this week to wrap up the legislative session, a tight timeline that makes debate on the legislation difficult. So we'll go ahead and end there because the rest of the article kind of just goes into expanding upon that. But that's the gist of the article anyways. So, Jeff, I wanted to go ahead and start with you. Just go ahead and give us your initial reaction to the article.
Well, again, just incredible annoyance. So I was brought to faith by the Lord's providence in a Southern Baptist church. You know, Baptists are accused of thinking we're like, I was born Baptist. I wasn't. I was reborn a Baptist. And I've been a Southern Baptist now for multiple decades. And everything you just described there is antithetical to who Southern Baptists are. But some of our institutions have been captured by left of center to extreme progressive individuals, and they want to weaponize the resources of what's the largest Protestant collection of churches to push this agenda. And so, I'll put my cards on the table, guys. I think Brent Leatherwood is a despicable human being. And the letter he sent to Governor Bill Lee is one of the most bold-faced lies I've ever watched from the leader of an institution. I read that letter and saw that Brent was representing himself as sort of speaking on behalf of Southern Baptists. And there are few people in Southern Baptist life who, if you polled the average church attending Southern Baptist, there are few people who would score lower on the scale of speaks on my behalf than Brent Leatherwood. He is a cringy and craven man. He's the sort of man that I don't think the people around him even respect, because he is such a weather vane for the prevailing winds of whatever the spirit of the age wants. And that he would have the shamefacedness or the lack thereof to represent himself as speaking on behalf of Southern Baptists when he has no meaningful relationship to Southern Baptists except parasitically taking a check from them because we can't run him out of the position because his buddies control the voting process. I guess I went to anger a couple times here, but it's just so aggravating to watch it happen. And actually I can go longer on this because I wrote a letter to Bill Lee. I've learned a ton since then from people who gave me kind of the back, what's happening backstage on that. But that's my initial thought. Like, how dare you, Brent Leatherwood? Nobody wants you to order pizza on our behalf. Why are you writing a letter to the governor?
Yeah. And, I can't say that I know much about Brent, and that's a lot of why I wanted to have you on, is just because you probably know more about the inner workings of the SBC than I do. It's kind of a confusing topic. And it might seem a little bit niche to some of our viewers who don't know what the SBC is. So really quick, can you kind of give us a little bit of an understanding of what the SBC is so that we can all kind of track a little bit better what the significance of this story is, not only for Tennessee, but for Americans as a whole?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of confusion about the SBC because kind of the default setting of religious understanding in society is something like the Roman Catholic model, where you have the pontiff at the top, and then you have like the cardinals and the bishops, and it goes out, and there's this real tight hierarchical structure, right? Or, Anglicans do a version of that. Lots of different groups do that. That's not what Southern Baptists are. The best way to understand Southern Baptists is that we are a collection of a tremendous number of local churches that are independent of one another, that decided to work together to do missions, theological education. And so my little church couldn't have much of a footprint in theological education by ourselves. My little church couldn't have much of a footprint in international missions by ourselves. But if I partner with 6 or 7, we can actually get some stuff done. We'll now scale that out. And again, you have, we're called a denomination that often, we're not really a denomination. But if you're thinking of a denominated group of religious people, we are the largest Protestant denomination in that sense. And so we have tremendous resources. We partner together through something called the cooperative program. Everybody puts their widow's mite in. That comes together to fund lots of different institutions. So we have an international mission board, one of the largest mission sending group in Protestantism. We have a domestic mission board that is one of the most wealthy mission sending organizations in the world. And then we train in our seminaries. I think we have 7 seminaries currently. Right now, Southern Baptist seminaries educate something like 82% of all evangelical pastors who come through a seminary system. It's huge. And that's why I think we have been systematically targeted by progressives to aim those resources in a bad direction. So as quickly as I can, Russell Moore's a figure of controversy. I was on the ERLC leadership board under him at one point. I thought he was great. I've realized how naive I was. I broke, with them at one point. So Russ Moore bails on Southern Baptist Life to go be the editor of Christianity Today. Brent Leatherwood was on his staff, and basically it appears that Brent is dancing to the tune that Russ is playing. So, a lot of my friends talk about the ERLC being ran by wire by Russ Moore. And Brent even got the job because Dr. Moore had made it such a toxic job that no one wanted it. They had stuck Brent in as a staff member under Dr. Moore when he left and said, hey, do this in the interim till we find somebody. Nobody wanted the job. And so, the job that nobody wanted got the guy that nobody wants. And it's this perfect collection of nonsense that has been the fruit of it.
Mm. Well, thank you for that background. Because
sorry, man, I know that's long,
helpful.
but
no,
that's how we got here.
It's helpful because, like I said, it seems like a really niche subject, but when you realize that this is essentially the largest denomination of evangelicals in America, you realize how the weight of the upper levels that are making these decisions, especially people that are, writing letters saying that they represent the majority of the SBC, which would equal to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of believers across the entire US. That holds a lot of weight, that letter. So with all that in mind, Anastasia, I do want to go to you for your initial reaction to the article.
Yeah, I mean, wow, you guys really covered it. I don't have too much to add. I mean, other than it makes me think about the point that Michael made earlier, which was that our culture clearly does not understand how to handle mental health. Clearly, because I the tell old thing that we've all used is, what is the gun? Just pick itself up and shoot everybody. You know what I'm saying? I think it's hard to fight emotion because I don't like school shootings as much as you on the other side doesn't like school shootings. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that maybe we need to start dealing with the heart and the person issue instead of, like I said earlier, the point of, when I say put a Band-Aid on it, you can put a Band-Aid on your cut. But then when you take that Band-Aid off, it's still there. Maybe it healed just a teeny tiny bit, but when you pull it off, it's still there. So I think that it's hard because I don't like school shootings, and hearing about what happened in Tennessee broke my heart, as I'm sure it broke all of your hearts and everybody's hearts in America, because nobody likes that. Just like we don't like when you kill your baby in the womb either. And we also don't like when you cut up your child when they're out there also in the world either. So you can't really, I'm angry because I feel like you can't really pick and choose when you care about children or when you care about people, because you care about people when they're in a school shooting, but you don't care about them when they're in the womb. And you care about people when somebody picks up a gun and shoots them, but you don't care about them when you're mutilating their genitals. I was going to use a different term, but I thought I'd be nicer on your guys' podcast. And you don't seem to care about them when you're doing that, and then you kind of just leave them. Or, I mean, like I've talked about the Iowa Jane Collective here in Iowa, how they deliver abortion pills to women's doorsteps, and then they just leave them. Well, you don't seem to really care about those women when you just leave them to bleed out. And then when they're texting you and they're calling you, you never really answer them because you don't know what to say. So I feel like you can't pick and choose your battles. Just like I'm bold enough to say that abortion is never okay, no matter what circumstance it is in. You can't really pick and choose. It can't be a murder here and not a murder there. And I feel like the same goes for that. Sorry that I went on a rant and I got a little angry.
No, I love it. I love it.
Can I jump back in on that picking and choosing your battle stuff? I know I've talked a lot here, but to that point, so Leatherwood is based, I think he lives in like Brentwood. His son, he had a child at Covenant who was in one of the classrooms where one of the children who was killed was a fellow classmate. So Brent is right there in Nashville. Okay. And to think again about the Southern Baptist Convention size, we're large enough to fund an institution called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. That's where Brent gets his paycheck from. That's supposed to be a lobbying voice to the federal government and other governments on behalf of evangelical concerns. So Brent has been in Nashville for, I guess, 3 years now, sitting as the head of the ERLC, while Matt Walsh has been doing cleanup work, particularly by dragging Vanderbilt through the mud, rightly so, and has made a major dent in the number of children who are going to be mutilated in the state of Tennessee. And Brent Leatherwood has sat silent as a tomb and has made, I mean, seriously, this is gift wrapped on a plate for him. He could simply say, we really appreciate what Matt Walsh is doing. We'd love to help. He has contributed nothing, but here he leaps into the public field to say, oh, let's figure out how to give the government greater power to determine who should and should not have a firearm. Thanks, Brent. We're really thankful for your work.
Well, and to add on to that, I think that it's easier to blame an inanimate object than it is to look inwards and look at yourself and look at the root of people's problems. Because it's easier to look at the gun sitting on the ground and going, oh my gosh, we need to get rid of you because you're the one, instead of looking within yourself and saying, what can I do? How can I help? And I think it comes back to, honestly, that a lot of people are in the business of being liked. And in this spiritual war, you can't be in the business of being liked, because just as Jeff was saying about his, small town, like, this war is going to find you no matter where you're at. You can be in a big place or a little tiny place, but all evil is coming for you. And when it gets there, you're going to be like, oh, come in, have a cookie. I want to be liked. You have to decide, are you on God's side, which is good, or are you on evil's side?
Well, and that is, again, I'm just riffing off what you said. So that's the crux of this thing. I think the first article in the first segment came from Conservative Christians of Tennessee. And if I'm wrong,
Tennessee Conservative News.
Okay, Tennessee Conservative News. So I had written I've gotten really good feedback from Bill Lee over the years. He was great on COVID. I heard back from his office really quickly. And so I felt real freedom to engage with his office. So I wrote him a letter saying, hey, Brent Leatherwood is a clown. Don't listen to him. He doesn't speak for anybody. He's a career evangelical, and you should disregard this. Clearly, your constituents don't want this. Well, after Conservative Christians of Tennessee published that letter as an open letter, I had a bunch of people reach out to me and say, you don't understand what's going on. So Bill Lee, his wife, had a good friend who was a substitute teacher who was killed at Covenant, which is an unimaginable tragedy. But what I found out is that Bill Lee approached Leatherwood to try to give him the moral credibility to push through some of these red flag laws. And I don't know if y'all saw this, but there's a member of the Tennessee GOP party who was on camera saying, we can't call this a red flag law. We've got to rebrand it because people will hate this. And so Bill Lee knows he's got legislation he wants to move forward. He doesn't know how to do it because he knows his constituency hates it. So he reaches out to this craven, career do-nothing named Brent Leatherwood and has him gin up this support and send this letter. I didn't know any of that when I reached out. And basically what some people who I think ought to have the credibility, the access to know, is that Bill Lee's numbers tanked among what would amount to wealthy conservative women. And he has late term ambitions that he wants to push through, and he didn't think his numbers would give him that support. And so this legislation is supposed to kind of puff that stuff up so that he can, whatever his later play is. And he made use of the SBC to do it. And so you think about all the criticism that progressive Christians like Dr. Moore has thrown at conservatives about how you're too in bed with the government and your hopes are too tied to what the conservative party is telling you to do and all this, right? Well, when Bill Lee, who's now a moderate red state governor, decides he wants to push through unpopular legislation, he rings the bell and these progressive little Christians scurry out to write the letter he wanted to help him with a PR campaign. It's about as craven and disgusting as you can get. But that's what's happening here in Tennessee with Brent Leatherwood and Bill Lee.
No, it's really unfortunate. And I did see that GOP member about we can't call it a red flag law. When you look at what it is, it's essentially the same function as a red flag law, just with a different name. And that's unfortunate because it's dishonest. And I think that the voters who are paying attention know that. It's just a matter of those who are not paying attention. When you're passively consuming news, very rarely it's going to be an easy thing to miss, which is, to me, that just speaks to leadership. That's just inappropriate. But I wanted to also mention that since Leatherwood and so many of these others, like Billy's wife, you mentioned, they know individuals that were personally affected by the Covenant shooting. I do want to make sure that I say we're not trying to be calloused here. Now, obviously, Jeff has stronger opinions than I do because he obviously knows much more about the situation than I do. But either way, it just goes back to what Anastasia is saying, that these type of measures have been shown time and time and again that they do not work. Look at Chicago. For crying out loud, that's got so much gun control legislation, and the crime rates in Chicago, and specifically the violent crimes and homicide rates by use of gun are nuts. And so if these individuals are trying to act in good faith, I would just encourage them to look through the statistics of Chicago's violent crime and rethink their position. Because if you are truly acting in good faith, and this is just coming from a standpoint of you experienced something tragic or someone you knew experienced something tragic, I can understand that. But you do need to realize that you are essentially attacking something that's our Second Amendment right. And there's a reason why it's a Second Amendment right. These are rights that you are not allowed to violate. And you are essentially actually violating human rights as the founders set up what we often consider our standard for human rights in terms of our civic law, that is. So I just want to make sure that I got that in there, because it's important to kind of add a bit of empathy for those individuals who are probably genuinely grieving, and to make sure that you understand, like, we're coming from a standpoint of we want to actually see real solutions work, and red flag laws clearly are not a solution that actually solves any problem.
Yeah. And Connor, to that point, if you want to do something legislatively or legally to address what happened at Covenant, there are unexplored options that present themselves immediately, right? What are the long-term mental consequences, to connect back to the previous segment? What are the long-term consequences of synthetic hormones on the brain? How does that affect mood? How does that affect social, sensations and things like that? We would love to have that information from mass shooters, particularly Aubrey Hale, who's a notable transgender one. You can't find that data. You can't address that because it's sort of cloistered in the medical community as if they're the only ones who should have a voice. What about weed? What about mood altering drugs, right? So antidepressants, things of that nature. Is she taking those things? What does that have to do with anything that's happening to her sense of herself and how she relates to her community? You can start exploring some of these things as a legislator and trying to address them by, certain things that we've done, like was previously mentioned. You can't have alcohol until a certain age because we don't think developmentally you're in a place to know what's going on. Well, maybe we should be thinking about that with these chemicals that we're pumping kids full of. And we don't really know what the long-term consequences are going to be. But that's not how these guys went after it. They went for the quick fix gun grab law that you've already mentioned fails. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff we need work on, and it's not red flag laws, but that's what they continue going back to. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. Michael, I know you haven't had a lot of chance to jump in with this segment, but please jump in.
Got a lot to say, so
go for it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, man. I'm loaded for bear on that.
Everything that has been said has been very good, but I want to kind of redirect our attention in this conversation a little bit. Everything you've been saying, Jeff, is really enlightening about the SBC, and it's really helpful to understand the context there. And Anastasia, exactly what you're saying is really relevant in the heart of how we should approach these issues. But what I want to do is I want to recognize specifically the disparaging philosophies between a conservative outlook as opposed to a liberal perspective. Because I am not willing to believe that the general liberal-leaning individual who consumes media and is persuaded is evil or intending evil against people.
Okay.
The main disparage, like I mentioned, is a philosophical separation of perspective, and the philosophy of the right or of the conservative party in general that I think we would all espouse ourselves to has a long-term perspective on almost every issue. So when it comes to abortion, we're not thinking about the immediate condition of the pregnant mother. We're thinking of the long-term viability of the child and the life that they may produce. When we think about the transgender issues and the chemical blockers and medical practices that are being put into practice for children and adolescents who are experiencing gender issues and are being prescribed these medical interveniences, what we are looking at as conservatives is often what happens 10, 15 years down the road when they are no longer struggling with their mental health in the same capacity and have regrets. Similarly, when it comes to gun laws, as a conservative, what our perspective is when there's a shooting, we are looking long-term, like Anastasia alluded to, that the mental health of these individuals, and Jeff, like you're saying, the influences of chemicals and the practices in our medical sphere that are influencing the behavior of individuals who are experiencing mental health distress, that's what we're looking at as a long-term efficacy to overcome school shootings. Now, what I think is really important to recognize is that from a leftist perspective, perhaps I shouldn't say leftist, but a liberal-leaning philosophy has a similar heart for justice, but their perspective on justice is immediate. So when there's a woman who's desiring an abortion, the justice concern is for that woman and her rights and her autonomy to practice whatever decision she has for her family and for her body. So they want to protect that individual as opposed to the individual that has yet to come and have autonomy on their own. Similarly, when it comes to the transgender issues, they're looking at the immediacy of children who are struggling with mental health issues and wanting to relieve them from the present danger of suicide and additional mental unwellness that comes as a side effect of their unstable condition with gender dysmorphia or dysphoria, however you want to say it. And finally, when it comes to gun violence, the immediate response to gun violence is to remove the weapon. And it's from a heart of wanting to protect children. And I do believe that a vast majority of individuals that are posting about this in social media or speaking out about gun violence for the sake of gun control are coming from this perspective that they want to protect children immediately. Yet we recognize from a conservative perspective, looking at the long term, that the immediate resolution is not a long-term solution. The long-term solution has to go to the source of the problem, and removing guns from people's hands is not the problem because it's not the gun that does the killing. We recognize that. But I really do want to speak to the fact that a liberal philosophy comes from a heart of desiring justice, and that justice may come from a variety of ethical leniencies, because we live in a world that is not bound to absolute ethics, but instead we have moral relativity that causes people to think all over the place. But it is important to me, at least, not because I want to defend the liberal agenda, but because the individuals that are experiencing these philosophies as a personal conviction are doing so from a perspective that they want to help people. And I don't know the intimate details of Leatherwood's perspective in the Southern Baptist Convention, but his immediacy to the situation, having his own children in that firing range and having a close intimacy with others who are at danger and at risk, puts him in a position where he is more inclined to respond to the immediate fear and the immediate solution that does not carry a long-term resolution to the problem. So for me, when I listened to this article, it was understandable that because of his fear and because of his influential people in his life who are promoting that perspective, it makes sense that he would lean that way. The problem is, it's not a long-term resolution. And I think a conservative agenda often looks at a long-term resolution because we want our children to thrive. And the left, or the liberal agenda, is looking at immediate resolutions. That being said, there are certainly people on the top of either category, whether conservative or liberal, that have wicked intentions through legislation. And that's undeniable. But I do want to protect the perspective of our friends and our family and our even viewers of this podcast to recognize that individuals that are seeking justice, and I feel as if their only perspective of that justice is from a liberal agenda, they, I believe, can come at that for really good intentions, and yet they fall from the mark of what the resolution can be because they're not looking at a long-term perspective. And that may be controversial. So I want to know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, well, really quick, I just want to jump in to say that I think that you're correct to give the benefit of the doubt. I would just say the struggle is that there are many individuals who are maybe the ones in the voting booths or the ones that are just in the crowds that are definitely what you described. I think what's hard is many of the people that have their hands on the levers of power on the left side of the aisle are individuals that have a very Marxist worldview. And I use Marxist just to say that they believe in power, and those individuals are drawn to power. And there are people on the right wing that fit that category too, of course. I'm not dismissing that. So the struggle becomes when individuals who maybe have good intentions but don't have the right facts or the proper worldview, if they don't believe in a biblical worldview, are oftentimes led by these individuals that maybe do have more nefarious motives. So that being said, that's just what initially came to my mind, but I'll let you guys jump in as well.
If I can address that real quick, I absolutely agree. And the nefarious powers at play that would be, like Jeff mentioned earlier, the individuals, the rabble that want to have drag shows in rural Tennessee where nobody else wants it. Yeah, that's a problem. But what I'm concerned about is the voter who espouses themselves to a liberal ideology without knowing precisely what it is they're doing, are fed this perspective that conservatives are their adversaries. And I think we've talked about it before. The false dichotomy of our bipartisan governance is such that we would have liberals who vote liberal but don't believe in that call themselves Christians and truly desire justice. They think that they are being attacked by conservative media, by conservative voices. And if all they're watching are certain political commentators or even past presidents, I can see why they would think that way. But I think the heart of Christ for our country and the perspective that we can have as Christians is to appeal in love to our brothers and sisters. And it would be much more effective for our nation's future to have those individuals who are voting in a more liberal perspective, if they could be understood and loved in a way that allowed them to believe that they were not adversaries to the conservative agenda, then they may be more easily persuaded to understand the love and mercy and justice that is being pursued by a majority, at least, of the Christian conservative movement.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, if I could respond to,
Please.
and I've got no criticism for trying to extend charity to those who may be across the political aisle from us. And I appreciate what you're saying there, that there's a lot of people who are just trying to do good and they're kind of jumping at the first thing that looks like it can. So no argument for me on that. There's a whole host of people out there like that. The issue with Brent Leatherwood, and I grant that he was right there at ground zero with his family. But so I would also grant that probably means he's not the person best prepared to address the topic on behalf of Southern Baptists, right?
That's
When
a good
someone
Absolutely agreed. Yeah.
is in emotional crisis, so I don't believe the best about Brent Leatherwood. I feel like I have kind of run up against insurmountable evidence that he's not a good guy. But if I were to kind of go into that space and be like, you know what, Brent, you are a good guy. I'm a good friend of yours. I'm going to tell him, like, you probably need to just sit this one out, bud. Your family needs you. Lean into your church, lean into the covenant community there, try to help them. But you're probably not at a place of objectivity where you can address this profitably. Certainly not on behalf of this huge swath of people that you have this very real and long-standing disconnect with. And so, I mean, I've come in pretty hot on Brent Leatherwood. I think even if you go to the most charitable read on him, you just say, man, it's just not the season for that, brother. Take a break, take a breath, let somebody else step into this spot. And I think it's telling that he didn't, that he saw this as his moral, jet stream to ride in on.
I agree. And Jeff, I'm not trying to argue against you and say that he was justified by any means.
Sure.
I think it was immature and unfortunate that he was even in a position to speak on behalf of anyone.
Yeah.
Because he's in crisis. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, for no other reason than the crisis, let alone his past actions.
Yeah.
And if I can add on to that really quick,
Yeah.
as I'm listening to everybody, I think just a quick note from me is like, yes, we need to be understanding and loving, but I think while we're venturing that line, we need to be careful as while we're being understanding and loving that we're not being affirming. And I think that can be a really difficult line for us to walk sometimes, because as Christians, we are called to love our neighbor, as Jeff has said many times, and to be loving, but I think sometimes we kind of cross over that line when we're being affirming. So I guess my quick note was just to heed a warning that sometimes being loving does not mean being affirming. And I think that's sometimes what the other side, I guess you could say, really struggles with, is that their whole thing is being affirming, is that they affirm everything. But if you affirm everything, then nothing is true. If you affirm everything, then what is it? And so I think as we go into this and as we walk that line, we need to be careful as well. And I would agree somewhat with Michael's point of, if all they're seeing is us bashing them, or if all they're seeing is the headlines of lefties go nuts again, you know what I'm saying? Like, it can seem kind of, I guess you could say, scary in the most simplistic terms, or it can seem like when you think about them and that they're so saturated in love and affirmation, and then they come over here, we don't seem cool, we don't seem hip, we don't seem loving, So, but yeah, my biggest warning would just be when you're walking that line to be careful of the difference of loving and affirming.
Yeah.
There's definitely something to be said that Jesus did not come preaching except for the kingdom of heaven is coming. He says, repent. So we are called to repentance, and we are called to preach likewise.